Thanks everyone for coming to the session today, navigating acceptance, uptake, and affordability across the life cycle. We have a broad group of panelists here, HTA agency representation, a couple of payers, real-world evidence expert, and some manufacturer reviews. So I hope we have a really robust discussion today. My name's Eric Faulkner. I'll be moderating the session. I'm a vice president at Evidera. I lead a Center of Excellence in Precision and Transformative Medicine. And I'll just go down the line just for a very brief introduction, starting with John.
Hi, I'm John Doyle. I'm an SVP at IQVIA. I run a team that uses big data and advanced analytics to measure healthcare system value, and I'm on faculty at Columbia University.
Louis Jacques, Chief Clinical Officer at ADV. I used to run Medicare National Coverage at CMS.
Hello, my name is PJ Keith. I'm the Director for Reimbursement Access and Value Strategy for the CAR-T portfolio at Juno Therapeutics, a cell gene company.
Hi everyone, Ron Phillip, Head of Commercial for Spark.
Good afternoon everybody, my name is Pilar Pinilla. I work for the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, the health technology assessment body in the UK.
And I'm Rick Powell, and I'm the Chief Medical Officer at MedPoint. Prior to that, I was on faculty at Baylor in Houston.
All right, thanks everyone. Just a couple of quick thoughts to start out before we just jump right in. So, the focus of this panel, so over the last year and a half, we've seen, the first of an initial wave of landmark therapeutics. These products are transformative. They're entering a marketplace that may not have anticipated their arrival from a reimbursement standpoint. There also are some affordability considerations that we'll explore today. Reimbursement systems generally are not built with these therapies in mind. Their cost, as we discussed this morning in the commercialization panel, creates some challenges and some opportunities. And payment centers around single administration, all the things that you know well. We're going to spend our time today talking in two basic buckets, the evidence package issues and then the reimbursement and payment issues. So one of the things that we'll start out with as an opener is we've seen the RMAT designation be launched, so giving a fast track opportunity for these therapies, for regenerative and advanced therapies. Magnitude and duration of effect are two of the critical pieces of the promise. It works a lot better and it lasts longer. I'd just like to start out by asking Ron and Pamela just to comment a little bit about how you balance that need the need to get there faster with the need to be able to deal as best you can with a long-term duration of effect issue, and what RMAT means in that circumstance to you from your experience so far.
Yeah, I mean, I think for a commercial guy, it's always going to be hard to say, no, I don't want to be first to market, right? So I think there will always be the desire to kind of be the anchor product in any particular market. I think it really depends in the gene therapy space on, what you're walking into, what kind of standard of care are you dealing with, what's the competition that was there previously. If the standard of care still left a high unmet medical need, I think you can go to market pretty quickly, even with a limited set of durability data. And then obviously, if it's a satisfied marketplace and the standard of care is good enough and the burden of proof to get the patients and physicians to trust your product is higher, then you probably need more. And I think that really comes down to, in either case, you still want to get to market as quickly as possible, because I think you're limited in what you can collect within the in the regulatory framework. You're going to be a lot better off by actually having live real-world evidence to be able to back up your claims. And I think it depends on the access and regulatory bodies. The more flexible they are in terms of incorporating some of that data, the more robust the platform that you have. And I don't think this is that dissimilar to some of the previous therapies that you've seen before. I mean, that most of the early oncology products were coming in for the sickest populations and then eventually started to go to the less severe. I think it's kind of the same thing here, where we the desire is to get the product as quickly to the market, to the patients who can benefit from them, and then you kind of figure it out after that based on how well the product does in the marketplace.
Yeah, sure. I think that I definitely agree with Ron, meaning that for the CAR T agents, the market that we're entering, these patients have less than 3 months to live, right? So these patients are beating down our doors in order to get into the clinical trials. So when we look at our data, I mean, for us, it's very important to get to the market as quick as possible, meaning that we're giving these patients a chance at hope of survival, whether it works or whether it doesn't, but we have an option for these patients that did not have an option before. So I agree with Ron that getting to the market as quick as possible is very important. I think the other thing, though, that I would say is that we agree with transparency in data and that we understand that longer-term follow-up is definitely needed for many stakeholders that are involved in this process for reimbursement and access. So we believe that any data that we have access to, that we have to publish that and make it available to the public domain. So people are seeing in real time what we're seeing to understand that if we have a 6-month CR, what does that mean at 12 months and what does that mean at 18 months? So we're very committed to that as manufacturers, knowing how quick we are coming to the market in order to help these patients that are in a very compromising position, meaning that, again, they have 3 months to live.
And Pilar, you are often then one of the very next recipients of this information. So we're trying to get these transformative therapies out to patients as quickly as we can for very legitimate, unmet need issues in many cases for the diseases that we're tackling in this space. What are your observations? I know that you've worked on several of these therapies and been involved in the group that is working on them with NICE. What are your observations about some of the pressure points, missing bits of information, and any sort of thoughts or solutions from a NICE standpoint?
Absolutely. So the reality is that products are coming to the market earlier, and they are coming with huge claims, huge potentials, but they are potentials. And we want to see them realized in clinical practice, and we want to make that happen. So I think that the systems are putting mechanisms in place to make that happen and to facilitate that. And that's why we are offering early engagements with companies, and we are huge advocates for long-term evidence generation and huge advocates for that engagements to happen earlier and earlier. Come with a plan, come with long-term evidence plans for demonstration of those huge claims that you want to provide to patients, because we want to provide patients with access to those transformative therapies that may well change the landscape of how we treat patients in the healthcare systems. So, I mean, we've seen the example with the CAR T, how all stakeholders have worked together in order to ensure that patients can have access to the therapy just days after marketing authorization. I think that the UK is the unique country right now in Europe who is providing that access. So I think that that's an example where we can demonstrate that we all want to work together, and if we work together, we can make that happen.
Okay. And Rick, from your standpoint, what does sort of fast track mean from a commercial payer perspective? What are your thoughts there in the context of these kinds of transformative therapies?
I guess as the designated payer up here, I agree with Pilar's point about the excitement at the potential of all these things. Certainly, we all of us are looking at for the ultimate effect on the patient and the patient's benefit. I think that there is still a desire for a demonstration of durability of effect. Yeah. And to some degree, the greater the investment in the beginning, the more caution there is that you're going to get, the bang for your buck, that it's going to live up to the potential. The excitement regarding so many of these transformative therapies is really genuine at all levels, and that's shared by the payers as well. Yeah. But by the same token, there's a good deal of skepticism or at least reservation of opinion about some of these things, because we've all seen where some of the claims haven't been fully realized yet. Sure. And so there's always sort of a degree of caution with these things. But I think the excitement really is throughout the entire industry.
And we'll circle back, but U.S. commercial payers have less of a toolkit to be able to deploy in terms of strategies like risk-sharing agreements and coverage
Right.
of evidence development than some other stakeholders, but we'll circle back on that in a moment. And Louis, and for those of you that don't know Louis led the coverage analysis group at CMS for many years and was the sort of mossy rock in a river of technologies flowing by for coverage decisions. From the CMS perspective, how does this fast track type of program, how would the agency kind of look at the data from that standpoint?
I think when you look at CAR Ts or anything else, frankly, it's the same paradigm that started with Sipuleucel T in 2009, Provenge. This is, from a payer point of view, sort of another version of the same technology, altering the patient's fundamental immune system, immune response to try to target a cancer. I used to tell people, if you're trying to sell me promise, I'll pay you with a promissory note. And, if you come through, I'll come through. I think the challenge with things coming to market early, it's like taking a junior in high school and throwing them into a college class. They may do well, but some of them won't. And when you're looking at the transcript of that student, do you say, well, yeah, they were here 6 years and it was kind of rough for the first 2 years, but look, they did better later? Or would it be better, if you wanted to be a successful student, to frankly wait until you were mature enough to take full advantage of college? And there are parents who intentionally keep their children back a year or two as early as kindergarten in order to help them be more successful. So as parents keep saying, the first impression you make is the one that sticks. Are you positioning yourself to make your best first impression if you're coming to the market with what I might call an immature or incomplete evidence base? And that's the challenge. I mean, as a payer, the issues around these things are, yes, they're absolutely interesting. CMS has, as you said, CED, although we never used CED for Provenge, which is interesting. But, so it's interesting to see.
Thank you. And this sort of tees up for a transition. So at least in the United States, we have the 21st Century Cures Act, which opens the door to development, use of real-world evidence at the submission level, but then obviously real-world evidence is critical, especially in single-arm launch scenarios, whether that be rare disease or cancer. Real-world evidence is kind of a bridge. And I'll ask this question of John. John, you spend plenty of time thinking about real-world evidence. Do you have any initial thoughts? Because real-world evidence provides the opportunity to at least have more of that plan that Louis mentioned. Any thoughts on opportunities and risks for real-world evidence early and what some of the advantages may be?
Yeah, sure, Eric. I think it's an exciting time, right, with Commissioner Gottlieb obviously opening up the aperture to consider a lot of new dimensions of real-world data, new channels to collect the data, new analytic techniques like machine learning to draw insights from the data. But the way I think about it is really we're starting downstream and we're trying to work our way upstream. What I mean by that is he first would use an example that we've been doing this for a while in post-marketing surveillance, using real-world data to demonstrate safety outcomes. And we're beginning to do it in terms of comparative effectiveness long-term and looking at risk-benefit trade-offs and different profiles in heterogeneous populations, because now we've come to appreciate that the real-world population that takes a drug ultimately is very different than the rather homogeneous population that is studied in trials. So I think that's all the downstream application that seems like it's almost turnkey in terms of doing this work. But some of the more exciting work, I believe, is around understanding real-world benchmarks and using external comparators, synthetic controls, some people call them, like avelumab in Merkel cell carcinoma. I think that has a real application to cell and gene therapy where there's no natural comparator, there's no natural control in some trials. Could you use real-world controls for trials? And I think there's going to be more of that. And you see some examples that are emerging, like the one I mentioned for avelumab. And then even further upstream than that, could we use the real-world data to better profile target patients, the ones that are at lowest risk for adverse events and highest likelihood for benefit? And that could be based on phenotype, could be based on genotype, could be based on omics data. So I think that is another area where we could use real-world data to better design trials and therefore products of the future.
Yeah, thank you, John. And I'll spend an inordinate amount of time thinking about real-world evidence as well. I think that real-world evidence in this cell and gene therapy space is even more critical than what you see with conventional products. And with the FDA opening the door for the real-world evidence, you can kill multiple birds with one stone. You have to establish burden of illness. You may be able to use it for regulatory differentiation in the Merkel cell carcinoma scenario that John mentioned. That real-world evidence was what enabled the company to achieve a broader label than maybe they anticipated going in the front door, actually. So it actually had a key benefit. And then obviously all of that real-world evidence will be applicable to payers and HTA discussions, and we're going to explore that part a bit more. Pilar, I'll bounce this over to you. From the NICE side, how is NICE beginning to alter, change the way it looks at real-world evidence? I mean, you're in a position where you have to look at it with any single-arm study, but any thoughts on how NICE is changing given the world moving along and use of real-world evidence increasing?
I mean, NICE is involved in several initiatives in terms of real-world evidence and methods and for synthesizing and analyzing real-world evidence because we need to use it. And we see real-world evidence, I would say, as a complement to other evidence generation packages, and it should be, but I think that nowadays with ATMPs is the only way to ensure long-term evidence collection. So those long-term registries will be crucial for ensuring patient access and reimbursement in Europe, for example. And that requires a lot of effort. That requires to having the appropriate infrastructure to collect that data. That requires the need to have the appropriate methods to analyze that data. And we are using it, for example, through the Cancer Drugs Fund, which collects real-world evidence in patients in the NHS in order to confirm whether the potential for clinical and cost effectiveness is realized. And the other thing that is needed is the commitment from all stakeholders for that data collection, that real-world evidence data collection, because unless all stakeholders commit to it, that won't be realized. It doesn't matter that a registry is set up if patients don't turn up for the data to be collected. So it needs to be a joint effort from all stakeholders so that data materialize in due time.
And do you see, so with the mock assessment that came out a couple of years ago now, there were, in whatever, a 250-page document, about 249 mentions of uncertainty. Do you see real-world evidence being a key component of helping to address some of that uncertainty, including ultimately supporting a stronger pricing position?
Absolutely. So that uncertainty will need to be mitigated in two ways. One is through that development of that real-world evidence that will support a coverage with evidence development, that I think that that's what we are aiming for.
Okay, thank you. And Rick, from a commercial payer standpoint, in general, you know, my experience speaking with commercial payers is you're still looking for that pivotal data, but there are emerging scenarios where you've got single-arm launches in oncology and rare disease. How are commercial payers thinking about real-world evidence? Is it you know, there seems to be a perception that it's something lesser than, even though it's more extrinsically representative?
I think there's definitely a learning curve, and it seems that over the last at least couple of years, more and more sort of coming to the reality that this is the future, and especially when you're looking at some of these unusual disease states, not the traditional model that we're so used to, you know, in the 15th version of insulin to come to market, you know, yet another ACE inhibitor, where everybody is so comfortable with the process, they know exactly what to expect. This is demanding a little out-of-the-box thinking. And there's so much variation from one organization to another, even within the organization, and we see some differentiation even in the provider community, because there's always this tendency to sort of, well, let's see if the providers really want to do this or not. let's see what the interest level is from the grassroots at first. And there's a variation between the community specialists versus those at the centers of excellence that are maybe a little more forward thinking or even participating in some of these investigations. So it's much more a patchwork quilt than I think it's ever been.
And Louis, from a CMS standpoint, how do you see the agency altering it, just similar to the question to Pilar, altering acceptance and use of real-world evidence over time, particularly in this area that's a little more complicated than average?
I don't think CMS needs to change anything. CED is essentially real-world evidence that's been going on for 10 years now. I think the risk for real-world evidence is not with the payer, but with the manufacturer. Because let's face it, pivotal trials are stacked in the favor of the sponsor. That's why you exclude comorbidities. That's why there's all the rest of these little things in there to enhance the likelihood of a positive signal. Real-world evidence means you include, grandma who's got osteoporosis and diabetes and hypertension and has had 2 strokes, or someone whose risk profile is not necessarily ideal. What I tend to hear from people is when you look at real-world data, the adverse events that were relatively minimal in the pivotal trial are actually more prominent, either more frequent, more severe, or both. So I think it's a double-edged sword. But fundamentally, I think CMS welcomes that kind of data because 74-year-old women who are the typical Medicare beneficiaries are not exactly, the peak of the distribution curve in a clinical trial.
Ron and Pamela, any comments you would like to make on lessons learned or thoughts about the importance in this cell and gene therapy space of doing the best you can with trade-offs and limitations of assembling a complete package?
Yeah, I think obviously we had to launch the product earlier this year, and we had to obviously communicate the price and set up a process for access. So the practical reality, was in front of us, and when we looked at our asset, and it's, as I said earlier today, it's very specific to each asset just because it's gene therapy. This particular one is going to be different than another one. So for us, it was a low prevalence, kind of disease. It was a complicated procedure that required careful handling, -85-degree fridges, hoods in the pharmacy, and not to mention each vial costs $425,000. So it was a more complex kind of logistical process that we needed to go through in order to get our product into the marketplace. And we knew that we weren't going to go into a broad distribution where every retinal specialist could do this kind of surgery. So our universe was fairly defined in terms of where the actual treatment was going to happen. And then it was just a question of, in those treatment centers, how would they want to handle this? And half of them said, you know what, we don't want to take on this product. It's too risky for us to be able to take an $850,000 shipment and not have, get paid. Or something else, happens to it, we drop it, whatever it is. And then we had the other side, the other half, that just said, absolutely, we're comfortable with buy and bill, we've got great payer relationships, we're confident that we can do this quite well. So what we try to do is be practical and be flexible for both sides of that story, and obviously that creates some complexity on the payer side. Payers want it one way or the other sometimes they're open to both. So we've managed through all of those steps in order to really just create access for the actual asset.
And one clarification on your story in particular is that when you guys were developing, at one point you looked and thought, well, the existing way to measure things may not fit what we're doing, so we're going to create our own way. Any thoughts about that?
You mean on the regulatory side?
Well, just the instrument used to measure.
Yeah,
like
so
stepping out of the box. Hey, you've got whatever, a bunch of PRO instruments that are out there in the literature forever, but are some of those things able to capture the real value we'll see these products. So you
Yeah.
stepped out of the box, and
Yeah.
any thoughts there?
We had a pretty unique endpoint in the regulatory process. It was called the MLMT, Multi-Luminance Mobility Test. It basically measures your functional vision. Up until then, a primary, functional test was around visual acuity. With RPE65, the mutation that causes the disease, it's not just the visual acuity, it's the full field sensitivity, the light perception. So we had to come up with a different mechanism. It essentially is a maze that has different light levels. So for regulatory purposes, in real controlled environments where we did it at Iowa and at CHOP, it's easy to do. You can funnel your clinical trial participants there. But when you're talking about 10 treatment centers and you're out there trying to commercialize an asset, you can't create a maze in every single place. You can't get the lighting perfectly. You can't have that kind of setup. So we had to find a corollary or an analog for that, and we ended up finding one in the FST. It was almost a one-to-one correlation between the two, and we were able to convince the payers that this is a mechanism that can be used. Now, a third party administers that test, and obviously they're collecting the data on behalf of the treatment center, and they obviously have a little bit more confidence in making sure that it's done in an impartial way. But all of those elements allow us to set up our outcomes program. What I was talking about earlier was primarily in the acquisition model for the asset itself. And as you get into higher and higher values for some of these therapies, you're going to see physicians, providers, treatment centers be a little bit more hesitant in terms of being, wanting to acquire and take that risk on. So I think the folks in this field are going to have to come up with different solutions that alleviate that risk for them and support the payers in what they need to do. But you're changing the entire healthcare landscape as you do that. None of that stuff is ready to go. So you're working with the payers at every single level, from the strategic level all the way to the operational level in terms of paying an invoice, and you've got to work those steps all the way through to be successful.
And Pamela, from the oncology side, which is a different animal altogether than rare disease, it's much more competitive. If there's one product today, there are probably going to be 10 tomorrow for a particular indication. How, in this cell and gene therapy space, any thoughts on the complete package that you would want to impart?
Yeah, I think it's very, very similar to what Ron was saying. I think that a lot of education is needed, meaning that the patients that we're treating, and again, I go back to the unmet need, we're entering orphan disease states where these patients have no hope and they have no options. So they're dying within 3 months. So if you can bring an innovative, transformative therapy where they're able to get a one-time infusion and no longer have to be subjected to chemotherapy and get complete response rates in the 50% and greater range at 3 months, 6 months, et cetera, and those complete responses are showing to be durable, we have to educate around the value of that. So I will say that I've worked in the oncology space for 10 years, working on oncology launches, and these agents are very transformative, but I think as manufacturers, our job is to educate and to educate early. And by educating, I mean we have to educate all stakeholders. I can tell you my past experience, we typically start educating CMS 12 months prior to launch. With CAR T therapies, we're engaging 24, 36 months prior to a launch. And we're at the table with CMS, we're at the table with commercial payers, and we're talking about the value that these products bring. We're talking about the unmet need that we're serving, and we're talking about as we move up in disease states, as we move up in lines of therapy, and how we think cost offsets may apply. So again, I think that as a partnership across all stakeholders. So manufacturers have to, again, educate those stakeholders and make sure that we're driving those conversations. We also have to understand what value means to those stakeholders. And we have to make sure that we're providing the data that is important to them in order to make those informed decisions as we move forward.
Thank you. And I think we'll circle back to, we're going to shift gears and talk about payment and reimbursement issues, but I think we'll go to some of the payment issues first. So, this initial wave of launches, you see prices in the roughly $400,000 to $900,000 range. one of the key concerns raised by stakeholders is affordability. You know, if you look at all the great stats that ARM puts together, there are around 950 therapies on the way to market and about 350 that are, you know, in the phase 2 and 3 zone. And so we've just seen the first of them. There's a paper that ARM and the National Association of Managed Care Physicians collaborated on, and in some of those workshops, the workshops that resulted in that paper, we talked about the affordability issue, the cost, and you know, there's affordability on 2 levels here that I'd like to discuss a little bit. There's the affordability at the individual product level, and then there's aggregate affordability with all of these things coming, and what does that mean? And Rick was part of those discussions, and one of the things that came from the payer discussions in that meeting was the cash flow issue. It's the ability of a health plan or a payer to absorb the lightning strike of a therapy that's in this price range hitting their actuarial pool. Any thoughts, Rick, that you would like to speak about? There were discussions of the Hep C products and bankrupting small health plans.
That's exactly where I was going. I mean, it's a cautionary tale. In very recent history, you look at the hepatitis therapies that have come out, and there you're talking about a $100,000 treatment, not $1 million treatment, and plan after plan among the small health plans have gone bankrupt. So, you know, you're kind of killing the goose there at the same time. I think that groups are being compensated at $30 to $40 a month, capitated at that level to take care of the entire patient's needs, from hospitalization to behavioral health to home health to everything. It's a big hit to suddenly have to absorb a $400,000, $800,000 nut. So that's one big part of the issue. The other thing, and you mentioned it a little bit early on, is the risk-sharing model. And that's something that I don't know how many people in industry even realize it is part of the picture, and looks like it may be coming on more in the future, where the providers themselves, the specialists, will have skin in the game. And that may dramatically change their ideas of what's appropriate therapy. And time will tell in that, because we haven't really seen how it works in the nuts and bolts level yet. But I think those are a couple of things that are very much in our minds right now.
Yeah, and just building upon that, if you look at the bone marrow transplant center landscape as an example, having worked on a half a dozen therapies that would be adjunct to conventional bone marrow transplant, when you go out and you talk to payers, one thing, and providers especially, one thing that you hear from providers is that even for a product that's $40,000, they have problems going at risk if they're not guaranteed payment.
Right.
Here we're talking about something else. There's no way the providers will go at risk unless there's some guarantee or assurance of being able to be made whole, which is
it's just not going to happen.
The industry has to think about up front. It's just as tied into the provider landscape, even more so than any conventional drug. John, you led a landmark landscape assessment recently in this regenerative medicine advanced therapy space. Any lessons, anything that you saw from that research about this individual product affordability? Any examples from cases, things that helped address the affordability issue?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Yeah, as part of the ARM Foundation, we have a health economic committee just trying to figure out, what's out there in terms of value frameworks that could be applied to cell and gene therapy, and taking stock of those frameworks, how could we do better? And so we're really thinking about it in terms of depth and just going deeper in terms of understanding clinical, economic, humanistic components to value, as well as breadth, and going earlier in a patient's journey in terms of even the prevention phase, and then following further through survivorship, et cetera. So what we found was that there are a number of frameworks out there. We looked at HTA agencies, we looked at some of the oncology frameworks. They're very diverse and heterogeneous. We did a study of about 40 products in 2016 and found that you found very little continuity and concordance between what value frameworks would say about one individual product. And so it's really tough for manufacturers to figure out how to evaluate their products and have those conversations early with payers if there's no balanced scorecard that's consensus driven. So we're evaluating this. We determined there's probably about a dozen factors that have not been considered to date. Some are micro level in terms of patient-centered endpoints, and some are macro level in terms of impact of benefit or burden on a healthcare system that should be considered. And a simple analogy I think of when I try to relate to what we're trying to do at a personal level is, if you think about how you tell a story, a personal history story, for most of the people in the room, you would use snapshots that were taken during major events in your life and holidays, et cetera. And the next generation is going to have, between GoPro and video blogs and helmet cams, et cetera, it's going to have a 360 view of what's happening. And that's what we're missing. We have these snapshots of what happens to a patient, and we've been using those to formulate these frameworks and figure out, when they come to the hospital, what happens and what should be measured in terms of economic cost and benefit. And when they leave the hospital, we kind of lose that sort of vision of exactly what's happening to them and how to measure it. But going forward, we're getting better, tying back to the early part of our conversation with real-world data, to understand that full 360-degree view of what's happening. We just need to mine the data to get a better answer and quantify it. I think that's the big difference now, is trying to quantify what's happening to these patients and measure it, even if we can't get complete consensus from every payer and every stakeholder on every variable. We need to have some consensus around a basic framework that we could use to have these valuation conversations, and that's what we're embarking on.
One of the issues, the single administration creates the issue that's been well discussed at this point, more or less, where most systems, it's pay up front, but then what other options are there? People have talked about amortized payments. In the commercial payer world, that probably has to happen within about 2 years, maybe 3 at the most, because of the transportability of patient issue. Louis and Pilar, from a CMS and a NICE perspective, any thoughts on something other than the pay up front? Are there going to be limitations based on statute that make it more complicated within the system to advance a something else model?
Predicting what Congress is going to add or amend to the Medicare statute is always a bit of a challenge. Yeah. I think fundamentally part of the challenge here was actually one of the pivotal decisions around Provenge. The evidence base was fairly straightforward, the 3 clinical trials, that's all been hashed out, frankly, in the newspapers. The bigger question was literally, what is it? What benefit category does it fall in the Medicare program? Is it a drug? Is it an immunotherapy? Is it a transplant of one kind or another? Is it a physician service? And the agency made the decision that it made, which is to treat it as if it were a small molecule. And I think we are struggling with the payment system for small molecules that you can just sort of churn off the line, get a broth of hamster ovaries and keep churning out the biologic, doesn't really fit for something that is individually tailored per patient. And I think that does call for the need for something different. But what that other thing is, on one hand, it's hard to, if I'm a patient and the doctor's saying, well, I'm not sure this is going to work, so I don't want to do it because I don't know if I'm going to get paid, and I'm only going to get paid if it works. I'm like, well, if you have those kind of doubts about whether it's going to work, why is your wallet more important than my life? I'd be a pretty angry patient if I was having that conversation. So whether you amortize it over years, I mean, this is the same as the Hep C discussion, whether you amortize it over the years, whether you only pay for success, whether you refine patient selection criteria, because if 50% of patients are responding, that means 50% aren't. What is the companion diagnostic for a cell or gene therapy that will allow you to have a success rate that is frankly closer to 80 or 90%? I have no clue what a companion diagnostic would look like in this space. But what I find from all my conversations with payers, if they're looking at a high-priced drug, they love having a companion diagnostic. They'll gladly pay for the test.
From the UK point, I would say that all stakeholders are equipping themselves to have those conversations earlier. I mean, one example is that we at NICE now have a commercial and managed access unit that was not in the scenario a couple of years ago. And we are closely working with NHS England now. So the affordability issue is much more transparent now, and we can facilitate those conversations through, for example, the Office for Market Access that now is built upon the organization. So I think that although in many situations the simple commercial deal solutions will be favorable for all stakeholders, in those scenarios where more complex arrangements are needed, efforts should be put in place. And I think that those should come with the evidence behind it. So I think that payers should get less risk averse while evidence matures. And with, for example, with the Cancer Drugs Fund now, we have the opportunity to revise those commercial deals as evidence matures. And I think that that will be crucial, because if benefits are being realizing, the value should be rewarded. But at the same time, HTA bodies and healthcare systems should have the opportunity to reduce that payment or to change that payment if the evidence is not there, or if the evidence doesn't show that the product is delivering what it was supposed to deliver. So I think that it needs to play both ways, and I think that the stakeholders are working together to have those conversations earlier, because if you want to have earlier access, you have to have had those conversations beforehand. Otherwise, it's impossible to have the mechanisms in place to grant access to these therapies.
And now I'd like to switch gears just a little bit to think about the aggregate affordability issues. In the late 90s, early 2000s, when we saw uptake of biologicals, there was a debate. It was on the headline of every newspaper in the United States. How are we going to afford these $30,000, $40,000 therapies? How is it going to impact the system? Now we're kind of coming through another cycle of this with the proliferation of rare disease therapies, the proliferation of oncologic therapies, with therapies in this particular space. If you remember the famous Jeff Goldblum line from Jurassic Park, life will find a way. So I want to explore some of the aggregate affordability issues here a bit. So we're seeing the first of these therapies come to market, and we're paying for them. And even though, and in some cases, uptake has been a little slower because it's just a more complicated scenario than your typical product launch and commercialization scenario. But what else do we need to think about? One thing that was advanced in the ARM NAMCP work, that the commercial payers universally that participated in the discussions universally said, yeah, this sounds like one way to at least handle it temporarily, was the concept of a risk pool, a high risk pool, where you're pulling out some of those patients that have, usually a risk pool is defined by risk, but maybe it's not a pool, it's a fund. So the ability to take patients that, the ability to deal with the cash flow issue, to take those patients that have that lightning strike cost and transfer that risk into a pool that commercial payers or other payers, stakeholders would pay into, so that the individual health plan has the ability to navigate. Rick, any thoughts you'd like to share there?
That, having been part of that discussion, I think there was widespread support, the thought being that obviously this lightning strike is buffered across a much larger pool. And it's funny, a group of folks who often are not very much in favor of government involvement in their businesses were all of a sudden very gung-ho about some sort of governmental payer involvement to spread this risk. It was kind of amusing to hear that. But at any rate, I think that's certainly one viable solution. That when you're talking about, and the portability issue becomes less concerning, because I don't again know how much industry realizes that how transient these populations tend to be. Here in California, in the managed care population, the average patient stays with a given group and health plan for less than a year. So even a 3-year amortization of a cost becomes challenging. So I think if we can spread this to some different entity that's larger than us, that would be well received and maybe help with the sustainability.
Okay. In the Medicare environment, Louis, there may be limits to the kind of tools that can be applied. attended the American Society for Gene and Cell Therapy meeting in DC a couple of weeks ago, and we talked a lot about, we had Mark McClellan, we had people from Medicare, from the Innovation Center, really are racking their brain trying to figure out both how to pay for these things in a different way, but are there other options? Would a pooling model be something that's even feasible, or a fund model even feasible or relevant in the Medicare context? What are your thoughts about the aggregate affordability issue? Does Medicare even worry about the aggregate affordability impacts and tools they may use to help address it?
Well, we never considered cost when making coverage decisions, which should probably terrify you as a future Medicare beneficiary and current taxpayer. When one looks at sort of the overall aggregate cost, I mean, there are government programs, for example, for vaccines around liability for adverse events from vaccines. There's a vaccine adverse event reporting system and things along those lines. I mean, the bigger question is, should cancer therapy be broken out from health insurance in the first place? When you buy insurance, your auto coverage doesn't necessarily come from your fire, your home, your whatever else. Is there some reason, would it stabilize fundamental health care to say cancer is different? You get a different cancer policy and you choose sort of whatever you want. I think one of the challenges in this space, and I've said it publicly before at NCCN, is this sort of thought that somehow we're going to save money if we do all this sort of stuff. I really don't think we won't, because every patient who lives longer is going to have heart failure, extraordinarily expensive, stroke, dementia, whatever. So I think we need to stop or halt the delusion that somehow cost-effective cancer care is going to be saving us a whole lot of global dollars. We're going to keep more elderly, chronically ill folks alive so they can get more expensive diseases, if not yet another cancer. Because treating you for cancer doesn't do away with your underlying risk factor for cancer unless they take the entire organ out if it's a spare organ that you don't need, okay? So at some point, we just simply have to admit we're going to spend a lot of money on this. And as a society, we either need to say, yeah, this is worth spending a lot of money on, or not.
And looking across the pond, you have examples like the Cancer Drug Fund. You also have the highly specialized technologies division for rare disease, and there have been discussions on rare disease management. I mean, the issue with the rare disease is there's only so much pie, and so much pie is allocated to rare disease. You can't make any more pie easily. So how do you handle it? And some of the debate there has been around metrics, like is it really showing the value, and sometimes something may not make it through. Any lessons, Pilar, that you've seen from either the Cancer Drug Fund or the debate about that gets to this aggregate affordability issue, and how to at least band-aid with some tools to help ensure that innovation gets out there, or some of the lessons from the Cancer Drug Fund, because it's been criticized, obviously?
I mean, the Cancer Drugs Fund now, I would say that is much more a success story than it was beforehand, before April 2016. Like right now, it's a managed access fund in order to allow innovation to come through earlier and for evidence to mature in a generalizable population while patients are accessing treatment in the NHS while evidence matures. So in order to assess that, we need to manage the risk for the payers as well through commercial deals. And I think that so far we've seen, I think that we have around 17 treatments right now with data being collected through the Cancer Drugs Fund. We have had the two first examples of therapies exiting the Cancer Drugs Fund and accesses routine funding because the evidence have confirmed what we thought that it would be. So I think that those success stories should keep us optimistic that this is possible. And we are in a learning curve through the highly specialized technologies program, as you mentioned, and through the Cancer Drugs Fund to see how these managed access programs can work in the NHS. How can we reduce the burden to the NHS, but how can we potentiate that mechanism so innovation can get through patients earlier. So I think that the lessons from the Cancer Drugs Fund are being paramount in that sense, and in being like bringing innovative payments to the table. Unless companies bring with innovative payment mechanisms, those won't occur, because companies need to bring those to the payers and put them forward to see whether those are feasible. Right now, for example, annuity payments are not on the table for many European countries, but that doesn't mean that they won't in the future. So we need to push for changes in that sense, innovative payment mechanisms, so we can make that affordable for the system.
And there's no easy solution for the aggregate affordability issues. If you look at risk pooling models, there have been state Medicaid models where there was less ability to spread the risk that involved just elevating certain high-cost patients. Those had significant adverse consequences in terms of co-pays, maximum lifetime caps, and other things that were applied that didn't work so well. There have been Canadian models that have been tried that dealt with the transportability issue reasonably well, and lessons from those, but it's still, you know, a kind of a journey to figure out how to handle this in the long run that I think will take, you know, everybody working and thinking together to figure out how to get there. But for the manufacturer today, you can't wait for the magical long-term solution to emerge. But before we open for questions, I just want to, Ron, one of the things that I'd like to just ask about are lessons from SparkPath. So you've got your compass, you're entering a world with a transformative product. Even in a scenario where you've got about 10 centers of excellence in the United States, you're still in a position where you're having to deal with, in each center, negotiating with multiple commercial payers in a way that you never would have to do for a conventional product. And you're also having to deal with the provider side as well. Any lessons from that you think would be important to consider, you know, navigating real world with a product entering a marketplace that wasn't necessarily anticipated or built for it, you know, an advanced therapy?
Yeah, I guess it's just prepare yourself for those early days. I guess is probably the best advice I can give. You're going to get through some of that variability over time. The treatment centers will start to normalize, you know, the pathways that they prefer, the case rates that they would want. The payers will naturally select the treatment centers that they want to work with. Yeah. The early days is probably where it becomes a little bit chaotic, and you want to obviously manage that to the best of your ability. But over time, I think it smooths out. And I think the only variable that you'll have to handle is the patient component. But I think again, it's just an early kind of a start, right? And you have to go through it. For a lot of the payers and for the treatment centers, this was their first foray into this as well. Yes. So there's a lot of inexperience on all sides. And I think over time, we're starting to just get to a normal cadence of how the process should unfold.
And Pamela, just same question very quickly, but from the oncology perspective. So we are starting to see transformative therapies enter oncology. Oncology is incredibly competitive space. It's very crowded, a lot of things going on, products with different platform approaches. We're starting to see companies think about combination studies with advanced therapies plus IO, which will be, if we worried about the cost impact of an advanced therapy when we start to bundle them in combination. Any sort of thoughts about navigating oncology decision making from your standpoint in terms of navigating through a reimbursement system that may also not be built, especially on the inpatient side, to receive these therapies?
Yeah, thank you, Eric. I think I would echo what Ron said, is that we're all learning together. This is new for everyone that's involved. And we anticipated some of the challenges, and we're working through those challenges strategically together. I think the one thing that I would say is, and I'll go back to my earlier comment, is that early engagement and early education is crucial to helping to inform these decisions in a rapid decision-making process that really isn't rapid. And I also think that we have to change our mindset, and I'll go to a comment that Louis made earlier, is that An 82-year-old cancer patient today is not the 82-year-old cancer patient that we were treating 20 years ago. And I will tell you recently what we did is that we took 3 CAR T patients into CMS, and one was 82, and one was 78, and one was 67. And these were all contributing society members, meaning that after they received the CAR T treatment, within 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, they returned to the workforce. Some of them were business owners. One guy owned 4 businesses, and he employed over 300 employees. One was a physician, and he was treating many, many patients for many, many years, and he's returning to that workforce. And another guy was a small business owner, right? So we are treating patients that are able to contribute back to society, no matter what their age is, right? So we have to engage early, and we have to educate. And we have to educate that as we get older, our mindset is changing, our value in the workforce is changing, and that we are able to contribute to society as an elderly patient population and treat these patients that can go back out to the society and be productive. So I think that we collectively have to change our mindset. And I think that starts with education for manufacturers and education to all stakeholders that are involved.
Thank you. And I think now we'll open up to questions from the audience. Please don't hesitate, don't be shy. You've got some great minds up here from the payer side, the manufacturer side, strategists like John. Yes?
Just I was struck by the juxtaposition of talking about, potentially, say, the oncology case where you may be extending life, and then someone's extending out to sort of potentially future costs. So, and then we kind of jumped over to rare disease, and I guess to me the thing that struck me there is potentially with some of the rare diseases, particularly in children, rare genetic diseases, we do really have the opportunity for something truly transformative, curative. And so I guess if it's this kind of reaction, shouldn't we really be making a very clear distinction between those 2 cases where, and particularly with a genetic disease, where we can deal with the prevalence, that we're only dealing with new incidents. So we actually really genuinely do have an opportunity to shrink the burden of that particular disease on that overall pie.
Sure, thank you. Rick, I'm going to bounce this one over to you from the standpoint of, how would commercial payers think about the difference between oncology and rare disease? The rare disease isn't so rare anymore given the proliferation of things. How would you think about that issue? And the difference between elderly patients often, sometimes with oncology, not always, but versus the genetic disorders. Any thoughts?
Well, the inherent challenge remains the same. You're still hit with $1 million price tag on a patient who you're going to have for 7 months. So regardless of how long the patient lives, that big burden is still there from the very beginning, regardless of which particular basket the category falls in. I think, though, it's certainly a valid argument that the therapies which are potentially curative, although I don't know that we know what 20 years from now means for that patient, since we don't know what health, a whole new Pandora's box of long-term health challenges and costs may emerge in those patients. So I don't think we can necessarily say we've eliminated the cost of their disease. We just don't know right now.
Any other thoughts from the panelists?
I think they are different for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is the numbers. There's a heck of a lot of people with cancer, and the appeal of taking a 3-year-old or a 3-month-old with an inherited metabolic derangement or immunodeficiency and allowing them to sort of, lead a free and full life is one that frankly is a little bit more appealing because it doesn't run headfirst into the futility issues that one is forced to confront when patients have multiple comorbidities. I think, and I've never been a commercial payer, although I get the impression from them that as soon as the newspaper has the picture of the little kid suffering in the mean old insurance company, that they find a way to make sure that story goes away. That ain't going to happen with 5 million old people with cancer.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
But I think, you know, you look at the hepatitis C case, which was a great case, right? And you know, there was no cure. We went through hundreds of products in development. And so when we start seeing cures, the price tag was $100,000. And just this case, Gilead came down to $24,000. It was the #1 indication for liver transplantation, which is now way down. And you're not transplanting for Hep C. So this is going to cost a lot to begin with, but we would imagine as science progresses, the cost will go down because our technology will improve, and over time we will end up saving money. So if you think of the Hep C patients who are no longer getting transplant, having the complications of transplant, or if you think of any of the patients with metabolic diseases, and no, you can't calculate because you don't know how long they were going to live, but they're living better and maybe more healthy, or as you're saying, the older cancer patients can be working. So the cost now is, that may not be long-term, just as it was in the Hep C. It's going to be that short-term for that early development with all those failures until you get more competition in the market.
Any thoughts, Ron or Pamela, from that? From, you know, it's obviously difficult for you guys to use your crystal ball to look into the future, but you know, the manufacturing costs are significant in this space. This is not your, you know, stamp out a small molecule product kind of scenario. And the industry, you know, the other industry aside from how do we get paid for this is how do we make it in the first place are the two challenges, you know, from an efficiency standpoint.
Yeah, I think the one thing that I would add to that is that, I mean, look, we're entering disease states where there are no options, right? These patients have 3 months to live. And so we're seeing complete response rates of 50% and greater. And you can't really sit up here as a stakeholder, myself, working in the industry, and so I can't say that I've ever worked on a product that I've seen a complete response rate of 50% or greater in relapse refractory anything, right? So to your point, I think about as we progress the technology and as we get better, those complete response rates are going to get better. We're going to get better. Our costs are going to come down. Therefore, everyone's costs are going to come down, and survival will get greater. So I agree with your comments. Absolutely.
Eric, I would just caution one thing. We can't necessarily assume that over time costs are going to come down. Unfortunately, we've had a few really scary examples from pharma in the last couple of years where older products have been sold and skyrocketed. So that's kind of poisoned the environment, and that argument, which used to be a standard one, now absolutely doesn't hold water. It's great that in the hepatitis environment the prices come down. That's laudatory, laudable. But I think we have to be a little cautious with the assumption that prices are automatically going to come down. One other issue with the transformative therapies versus, say, I would draw as an example the cancer chemotherapies, where we see statistics of this therapy was successful, patient lived 2 months longer. That's going to get a different emotional response from a payer versus this 6-year-old is now going to have theoretically a normal lifespan. So those things vary a lot in the emotional level.
Okay. All right, I think we're out of time. We're getting the universal signal for time to stop. But thanks to the panelists, and thank you guys so much for joining us.